Bibliophiles of the internet, round 16 of the Queer Lit Read-a-thon is quickly coming up, and I have recommendations for pretty much every single prompt. For the uninitiated, the Queer Lit Read-a-thon is a biannual event where you read nothing but queer books. It was created by my friends Kathy and Rogan, whose channels I will have linked down below. Rogan is no longer hosting, but you can find all the details about the read-a-thon and this upcoming round on Kathy's announcement video. I'm also going to redirect you to my friend Alex of Pucks and Paperbacks, who recently made a video very similar to this, so if you want even more choices, definitely check that out. As with every round of the Queer Lit Read-a-thon, there is a lovely bingo board full of 16 prompts that you can tackle throughout the read-a-thon as you so choose. So we're gonna jump right in with the first prompt, which is pansexual main character. Now, I'm sure this prompt is open to panromantic characters as well, but I did stick to pansexual characters specifically in my 2 suggestions, just to be safe, starting with Bad at Love by Gabriela Martins. This is a super fun queer YA romance about a teenager named Daniel who's part of this pretty famous band called Mischief and Mayhem, and ever since they made a name for themselves, he's been touted by the paparazzi as the band's token bad boy. Then there's Sasha, a certified bad boy hater, and also interning for a pretty big magazine that specializes in celebrity gossip. So when her path happens to cross with Daniel's, she sees a chance to get close to him, learn his secrets, and maybe turn that into a story that she can use. In terms of representation, both characters are Brazilian. One is an immigrant, the other is part of the diaspora, and Sasha is pansexual and Daniel is demi-romantic. I've really enjoyed both of Gabriela's YA romances. They're fun, fluffy, adventurous, heartfelt, and absolutely chock full of pop star and pop culture shenanigans. My other recommendation would be Miss Meteor by A.M. Macklemore and Taylor K. Mejia. This is a contemporary YA story with just a pinch of magical realism. It's about 2 characters, Lita and Chicky, who are taking part in the Miss Meteor beauty pageant even though neither of them are what you would consider to be typical beauty queens. Lita is a fat beauty queen literally made of stardust, and Chicky is a butch pansexual outcast. They used to be friends but are no longer, but even their fraught history is not going to stop them from teaming up to try and pull off the greatest underdog story their small town has ever seen. This is a really wonderful, underrated book. It's joyous and affirming in so many ways, and it's just really a beautiful celebration of these 2 queer characters striving to authentically be themselves without changing or losing themselves. This could also potentially count towards the TBR Oldie prompt because it came out back in 2020. The next prompt is Southern Hemisphere, and even though I think my 2 recommendations are fairly obvious, I'm gonna say them anyways, starting with, of course, The Gods of Tango by Quero de Robertes. This is Latina historical fiction about a trans man who we eventually come to know as Dante, but the story begins when he's still presenting as a woman and his family forces him into an arranged marriage with a man living in Buenos Aires. But when he arrives, he learns that his fiancée has been killed. Now he has nowhere to go, no place to stay, no contacts, no money to his name. All he has is his father's violin and a burning passion for tango music. So because men are the only ones who can become professional tangueros at this time, he begins presenting as a man so he can finally master the violin and become a professional musician. Listen, I've talked about this book a million times. It is a truly extraordinary story, and you should definitely read it if you haven't yet. And this could also count for the historical fiction prompt. On a somewhat similar note, my other recommendation is The Air You Breathe by Francis de Pontes Peebles. I talked about this in a recent Latina Book Rex video. It's a sapphic historical story that takes place in Brazil during the 1930s and follows Dores, a young girl working in the kitchen of a sugar plantation, and Graça, the spoiled daughter of the sugar baron who owns the plantation itself. The 2 of them spark an unexpected friendship, especially bonding over their shared love of samba music. And when they realize that Dores has a knack for songwriting and Graça has a beautiful singing voice, they decide to run away together to Rio de Janeiro so they can try to become famous chambistas. Again, this is just a really wonderful story. If you love books that explore celebrity, the toxic highs and lows of fame, the ways that fame and hubris can corrupt love and friendship, then you should definitely read this. And again, if you're looking for books that can double up on prompts, this one would also count towards historical fiction. The next prompt is really fun. It's a rainbow flag cover, which means a book where the color scheme or design scheme on the cover itself either resembles a pride flag or features a pride flag of some kind. My first recommendation is In Deeper Waters by F.T. Lukens. This cover definitely resembles the Pan flag. It's a whimsical fantasy story about Prince Tal who's going on his coming-of-age tour so he can finally explore his kingdom for the very first time. But 2 short days into the tour, he's captured by pirates and held ransom in a plot to get him to forcibly reveal his hidden magical powers. On board the ship, he discovers another prisoner, a mysterious boy named Athlin, who might just be his only hope of protecting his magic, saving his family, and preserving the kingdom itself. This is a very fun fantasy adventure and also a bit of a queer fairy tale retelling as well, so for that reason this could also count towards the fantasy space. My other selection for this prompt is Old Wounds by Logan Ashley Kisner. Both the first edition cover and the recent re-release resemble the trans flag. This is a YA horror story about 2 trans teens who are trying to run away to California when they find themselves stranded stranded in the woods of a small Kentucky town. To make things worse, the locals believe there's a vicious monster lurking in the woods that requires a female sacrifice in order to be pacified, and with 2 new strangers in town, they believe they've found themselves the perfect candidates. I recently read The Transition by Logan Ashley Kisner, which was fan-fucking-tastic. It doesn't really fit in with any of the prompts for this round, but I also recommend it. Old Wounds is their debut novel, I believe, and their style of trans horror is perfect for fans of Lee Mandello and Andrew Joseph White. Next, we have The Free Space. Obviously, I can't recommend specific books for this because you make up your own prompt, but I do have some ideas for prompts that you can use. You can read a poetry collection, a short book, a book in one sitting, a book in verse, a book that was recommended by a friend or book reviewer, something that you checked out of the library, a book written by an Indigenous author, a book published by a small press. The possibilities are endless. The prompt after that is other language, so basically a book that's been translated from one language into another. My first suggestion is Walking Practice by Dolki Min, translated by Victoria Cottle from the original Korean. This is a blend of sci-fi and horror. It's about a shape-shifting alien that's crash-landed on Earth, which they have no knowledge of, and as they try to reteach themselves the basics of existing, like how to walk again, they decide to hunt for food and subsequently discover that humans are quite delicious. I've heard really great things about this book. It seems a little bit absurdist, a little bit existential, and I think it presents a fascinating thought exercise regarding what it means to truly be yourself if you have to constantly adapt yourself in order to survive. My second suggestion is Bad Girls by Camila Sosa Viada, translated by Kit Maud from the original Spanish. This is a fictional story about a character named Camila who knows that she's trans from a very young age, but is resigned to keeping her head down, especially with her abusive and alcoholic father. But once she's old enough, she leaves the city to attend university and eventually slips into prostitution in order to make ends meet. That's how she discovers this strange, wonderful world of trans sex workers who take her in as one of their own and help her to find her place in the world. I know this is a very beloved book, especially in queer Latina literary spaces. I have not read it yet myself, but it's been on my TBR for a while, and I think it's a really great choice if you're looking for queer translated work. Moving right along to the fantasy prompt, my first suggestion is Running Close to the Wind by Alexandra Rowland. This is a seafaring fantasy adventure said to be ideal for fans of Our Flag Means Death. It's about a character named Avra who accidentally steals the single most expensive secret in the world and immediately runs away to the sea where he hopes he won't be found. He's looking for a buyer with very deep pockets to sell this information to, which is why he has to turn to his on-again, off-again ex, the pirate captain Taveri, for assistance. I read A Taste of Golden Iron by Alexandra Rowland a few years back, and I really enjoyed it, so this release has been on my radar ever since. It sounds like a fun, swashbuckling, adventurous story, and if it's anything like A Taste of Golden Iron, then I'm sure it's also a little bit ridiculous while also being deeply romantic. I thought I would also take this chance to once again recommend Coffee Shop in an Alternate Universe by C.B. Lee. This is a contemporary YA fantasy about a chronic overachiever named Brenda who's about to submit a scholarship application when she loses internet access. She is desperate to find a Wi-Fi connection somewhere, and that's when she stumbles into this cafe that she's never seen before. And after submitting her application, she hits it off with a very cute barista behind the counter, and the two of them exchange numbers so they can go on a date. But what they don't realize is that they actually live in 2 different universes that just happen to be overlapping in that moment. So they might have to do a little magic and make some tears in the fabric of reality itself if they ever want to go on that date. I really enjoyed this YA fantasy. I found it to be very refreshing and heartwarming. I think it's a really fun spin on a sort of multiverse romance, and I think the story uses magic in really interesting and thoughtful ways. Next is a brand new prompt all about picture books, and the first picture book I have to recommend is Me and My Dysphoria Monster by Laura Kate Dale and illustrated by Hui King Ong. This is about a young character named Nisha who often gets misgendered by other people, causing her dysphoria monster to grow larger and larger, until she meets a trans man named Jack who shows Nisha how she can shrink her dysphoria monster back down to size. This sounds like a really great story for people of all ages, but especially for younger readers who might be learning about concepts of gender and dysphoria for the first time. It might be a great way to open those discussions with them, and it also just seems like a really great story about how powerful it is to feel like yourself. Another picture book that recently came out is One Day in June by Tourmaline and illustrated by Charlotte Christensen. This is a vibrant and joyful biographical picture book celebrating the life and legacy of Marsha P. Johnson, a legendary Black trans woman and activist who played a pivotal role in the Stonewall riots. I think biographical picture books are an amazing way to keep children and younger readers connected to history and engaged with historical figures in a way that feels exciting, fresh, and accessible, and this just seems like a really beautiful tribute to Marsha P. Johnson's incredible life. Our next category is season, and from what I understand, this can be pretty open-ended. You could read something set during the current season, you could read something for the holiday season, you could read a book with a season in the title or set during a specific season of the year. It's really your choice. Because we're headed into winter, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere, and also the end of the year holiday season as well, that's just where my mind went for this prompt, but again, it's very much up to your interpretation. So with that in mind, my first suggestion is Second Chances in Newport Stephen by TJ Alexander. This is a queer holiday romance about a trans man named Eli who's returning home to Florida for Christmas, not just to be with his family, but because there's some kind of scandal threatening his career as a TV writer, and he figures the best thing is to lie low for a bit. So not only does he have to navigate reconnecting with his family after years of transitioning and getting himself sober, but he also has to hide the fact that he's not the comedy success everyone thinks he is. And of course, he also runs into his super hot high school ex, and shenanigans ensue. I think this could be a great pick because it's set during the Christmas season, but it also seems like a fun and thoughtful romance exploring the reality of navigating family and love as a trans person. Plus, I've heard it's really sweet. My other recommendation is a little bit outside the box, but you can definitely tell from the cover that this book is set during winter, and that is We Used to Live Here by Marcus Kluwer. Yes, this very popular horror story is in fact a queer book. It centers around a lesbian couple, Charlie and Eve, who just moved into this old house deep in the mountains that they plan to fix up and then sell for a profit. One day, a family knocks on their door and the dad claims that he used to live in that same house. He asks if they can come inside so he can give his family a tour, and once they're inside, inexplicable things immediately begin to happen. This story is so strange and disturbing in ways that I can't even really describe. It's one of those stories that very much lingers long after you've turned the last page, and I also think it uses foreshadowing, code breaking, and real found media in fascinating and deeply unsettling ways. The next prompt is debut, which once again is fairly open-ended. This could be an author's first published work or their first book published in a new genre or age category. My first recommendation is You Weren't Meant to Be Human by Andrew Joseph White, which was his adult horror debut. This is a blend of horror and sci-fi about an autistic trans man named Crane who does not speak by choice, and he belongs to this sort of cult-like alien hive controlled by sentient worms who offer protection in exchange for allegiance. When Crane accidentally becomes pregnant, the hive demands that he carry the child to term, even though that's very much not what he wants. This is a deeply disturbing, fucked up, gross story that doesn't pull any punches when it comes to exploring unwanted pregnancy, especially as a form of body horror in and of itself. It's intense, it's high stakes, it's deeply uncomfortable, and driven by a deep-seated sense of rage. And like all of Andrew's books, it provides an unforgettable, violent kind of catharsis. On a very different note, at least in terms of genre, I also recommend The Lilac People by Milo Todd. This is Milo Todd's debut novel that just came out this year. It's a harrowing piece of historical fiction set during the 1930s in Berlin, where a trans man named Bertie is living openly as himself and working at the Institute of Sexual Science. But of course, when the Nazis come to power, his way of life comes under threat and everything drastically changes. Bertie and his girlfriend Sophie manage to evade detection by taking on the identities of a deceased elderly couple and living off a farm in the countryside. But during the final days of World War II, with their freedom in sight, they discover a young Jewish trans man collapsed on their property and decide to take him in and save his life. Again, I would definitely describe this story as harrowing. It's not an easy read by any stretch of the imagination because it gives the proper weight to the kinds of surveillance, torture, and genocide that was committed in Germany during this time. But it's also a powerful reclamation of trans history, especially, that would otherwise be erased. And of course, if you chose to read this, it would also count towards the historical fiction prompt. The next category is another fun one. It's detective, meaning any story that follows some kind of detective, sleuth, or investigator, either professional or amateur. And firstly, I have to recommend The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is another popular series that you may not have realized was queer, but it's a really fun, mind-bending blend of fantasy and mystery following a Sherlock Watson-type duo, Anna and Cole. Anna is an extremely eccentric yet brilliant detective, and Cole works as her assistant because he has the magical ability to perfectly recall anything he sees or hears. In this first book, there's a high imperial officer who's found dead and appears to have been killed when a tree spontaneously erupted from his body. And the two investigators have to figure out what really happened and what is the truth behind this deadly magic. I recently caught up on this series and I've really enjoyed both books in the series so far. Like I said, there's very much a Sherlock Watson dynamic between the two main characters, which is endearing and quirky in every way you can possibly imagine. And the mysteries in both books so far have been equally captivating and curious. And of course, reading either book in this series would also count towards the fantasy prompt. I would also recommend a fairly recent read of mine, which was Bad in the Blood by Matteo El Cirilli. This is a combination of historical fantasy and noir set in the city of Pucksport, where humans and fae coexist, but because fae are said to possess uncontrollable magic, they're seen as incredibly dangerous. The main characters, Grisel and Hawthorne, are not only siblings, but they are respectively human and fae, and when a violent murder happens at the docks, all evidence seems to point towards a fae killer. So Grisel has to begrudgingly follow in his late father's footsteps to investigate the case if he wants to protect Hawthorne from falsely being accused of this crime. This story really took me by surprise. I think it very successfully blends together all of its genre inputs and centers a really dynamic and complex sibling relationship. I also recommend the audiobook if you can access it because there's a lot of really cool production elements using music and sound effects that really drive home the story's noir vibes. If you read this book, it could also count towards the fantasy and historical fiction prompts. The next prompt is BIPOC Nonfiction. First, I want to recommend a book that I actually just finished reading as of filming this video, and that is How Far the Light Reaches by Sabrina Imbler. Sabrina Imbler is a queer, non-binary, biracial journalist working in the science and conservation field who's always been drawn to life in the sea, and especially creatures living in hostile or remote environments. Each chapter in this book focuses on a different sea creature and explores how some of the most radical forms of family, community, and care can be found in ocean life. And there's also elements of memoir as the author connects this back to their own experiences. This is a book that was on my TBR for so long, but it stayed on my TBR for very good reason. I think it does a great job of balancing memoir and science writing. It's both informative and emotionally striking all at once. You will learn something, but you'll also feel something. And I think that's the mark of truly tremendous nonfiction. I would also suggest Refusing Compulsory Sexuality by Sharonda J. Brown. This is exactly what it says on the tin. It's an interrogation of sex culture and its prevalence from the lens of a Black asexual perspective. It's an exploration of how the mistaken assumption that everyone wants sex and has sex is inherently intertwined with the structures of capitalism, race, gender, and even our conceptions of queerness. As a demisexual Mexican-American person myself, this is a topic I'm really drawn to and one that I would love to learn more about, especially from a Black author, since these kinds of writings and discussions are still overwhelmingly dominated by white bodies and white voices. I'm not going to give synopses for them, but I did want to give honorable mentions to So Many Stars, An Oral History of Trans, Non-Binary, Genderqueer, and Two-Spirit People of Color by Quiero de Robertis, which is every bit as expansive as it sounds, and also Miss Major Speaks by Miss Major and Toshio Meronek, because reading that would be a great way to honor her life. I've already mentioned quite a few books that would check off the historical fiction space, but I'll recommend two more just to be sure, starting with The Warm Hands of Ghosts by Catherine Arden. This is a queer World War I story with a touch of surrealism or magic. It's about a combat nurse named Laura who's wounded and discharged from the medical corps, and when she returns home to Canada, she receives word that her brother Freddie is believed to have been killed in combat. But something about the message just seems off to Laura, and she believes that her brother may still be alive. So she returns to Belgium under the guise of volunteering at a private hospital, and there she hears whispers about haunted trenches and a strange hotelier who lures in fallen soldiers. Listen, it's no secret that I think this book is masterfully told. It was the very first book I read this year, and it stuck with me all this time, over all these months, as freshly as when I first read it. It's a really phenomenal exploration of how our bodies are not the only things on the line, but also our inner worlds, our feelings, our beliefs, and how those things are every bit as worthy of protecting from destruction in any way that we can. I would also recommend The Duke Steals Hearts and Other Body Parts by Elias Coles. This is a YA historical story with just a touch of necromantic magic. The main character, Philip, is a trans boy who possesses a kind of magic that allows him to remove people's body parts, and he's basically a con artist who makes a living ransoming those body parts back. But one day he gets caught up with a mark who claims that his sister, Adeline, has been taken. So in order to strike a deal with Adeline's former employer in exchange for information, Philip's best bet is to disguise himself as a duke. This is a bizarrely charming historical fantasy that's macabre and dark and just slightly off kilter, but I think it's niche in the best possible way. Like, if this happens to be your niche, you will really enjoy yourself. Again, there's a bit of magic in this one, so I think you could definitely make a case about how this would fulfill the fantasy prompt. The next prompt we have is TBR Oldie, which again is pretty open-ended. Obviously, I don't know what's been on your TBR for a very long time, so I just picked a couple of backlist books that might have been on your TBR for some time that you haven't gotten to yet. First is Amateur by Thomas Page McBee. This is a really short memoir from Thomas, who was the very first trans man to fight in a charity boxing match at Madison Square Garden. This memoir is basically recounting how he got himself into that situation, how he trained and mentally prepared himself, what the experience was like, all the while untangling the toxic masculinity of male violence and male gender roles that he really had to unpack. Listen, even if you're not into sports or reading about sports, make no mistake, this is definitely not a sports memoir. The subject of the charity match is definitely at the forefront, but it's really a rumination of how this experience forced Thomas to confront his relationship to aggression and violence, and how that tied into his understanding of his own transness. And you know what? It really works because the memoir creates a really effective parallel between Thomas being an amateur boxer while also being an amateur in his own gender, his own body, his own life in so many ways. Also, if you haven't read it yet, I think you should really read Darius the Great is Not Okay by Adib Khorram. This is a really heartfelt, queer, contemporary coming-of-age story about an Iranian-American teenager named Darius who is clinically depressed and doesn't feel very connected with his Persian heritage. But then his family takes their first ever trip to Iran so that Darius can finally meet his grandparents. And when Darius unexpectedly becomes friends with his grandparents' neighbor, Sorab, everything about his life changes and he begins to feel more and more like himself. This is such a beautiful, tender-hearted story that absolutely has the power to change lives. It's a beautiful depiction of earnest, vulnerable, loving friendship, and it's just a really wonderful celebration of connecting with your history and by extension, with yourself. Now let's talk about middle grade books, which are typically defined within the industry as any book intended to be read by those between the ages of 8 and 12. My first middle grade recommendation would have to be Puzzle Heart by Jen Reese. This is a really fun middle grade mystery about a 12-year-old non-binary kid named Peregrine whose dad is going through a bit of a rough patch, so they devise a plan to take a road trip to their dad's childhood home, which happens to be a very mysterious bed and breakfast that their grandparents built. But the house itself was never actually open to the public because it seems to have a mind of its own. The hallways shift around, encoded messages are hidden everywhere, and as the house's puzzles become progressively more and more dangerous, Peregrine will have to solve every last riddle to uncover the mystery at the heart of the house. This story is super adventurous. It's full of mysteries, riddles, and codes that the reader has to solve alongside the young heroes at the center of the story, which makes it really fun and exciting to read. And there's also a lot of practical information in here about safety, survival skills, and problem solving that are great for readers of all ages. Also, the audiobook is read by Avi Roque, so I highly recommend it because it is an absolute delight. I would also recommend The Beautiful Something Else by Ash Van Otterloo. It's about a non-binary kid named Sparrow who's desperately trying to be on their best behavior and hold everything together as their mother begins to struggle with addiction and really fall apart. It gets so bad that Sparrow is sent to live with their aunt on a sprawling estate full of colorful new neighbors and a whole host of new experiences. And to make things more complicated, Sparrow Shadow has decided to take on a life of its own and is encouraging them to try all the things that they never felt safe enough to do around their mom. This is one of my favorite books. It's such a beautiful story about coming into your own, being brave enough to make your own rules, and to live your life without any limitations or expectations other than your own. It's a really wonderful coming-of-age story that I cannot recommend enough. Penultimately, we have the prompt Bookish, which basically means that books should be involved in some aspect of the story. Firstly, I would love to recommend a recent read of mine that I absolutely adored, which was After Hours at Dooryard Books by Cat Sebastian. This is an incredibly endearing and hopeful queer historical romance set in New York during the 1960s. It's about an elderly landlady who owns a bookstore as well as the apartments above it, and she has a tendency to take in strays, basically people who are going through something, struggling with addiction or poverty or homelessness, and she allows them to work in the bookstore and live in the apartments rent-free until they can get back on their feet. One of the main characters, Patrick, was once one of those strays himself, but now he's basically the co-owner of the bookstore, and his quiet, comfortable life is turned upside down when a new mysterious tenant named Nathaniel comes to stay at Dooryard Books. This is just about as bookish as a story can possibly get. Not only does a majority of the story take place in the bookstore itself, but there are scenes involving book buying, book selling, book inventory, and there's a super cute found family at the center of the story that loves to to recommend books to each other and borrow books from each other, which is really fun. It's just absolutely wonderful. If you're looking for an incredibly soft romance with a quiet kind of intimacy and yearning, if you're looking for a glimmer of hope in these so-called unprecedented times and want to be reminded of what it is we're supposed to be doing here, you should definitely read this. For my other bookish recommendation, I wanted to go a bit outside of the box again, so I'm going to say that you should check out A Haunting on the Hill by Elizabeth Hand. This is the first ever officially authorized novel to return to Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. It's basically a modern sequel that takes place in that same house. The main character, Holly, is a struggling playwright who's recently received a huge grant so she can finish developing her play, and that's when she stumbles across Hill House in some kind of rental listing and she decides it's the perfect place to rehearse. So she rents it out for herself, her girlfriend, and some of her fellow writer and actor friends. And of course, as soon as they begin to settle in, the house begins to let its peculiarities become known. I read this early last year and really enjoyed it. I think it's a solid and interesting modern take on a classic setting, and I do think it does the atmosphere and aesthetic of Hill House justice. In my head, this is clearly a bookish story, not only because several of the main characters are writers, but also because the entire conceit and the setting of the story itself are based on an incredibly famous book. The last prompt on the bingo board is 16 letters, paying homage to the fact that this will be the 16th round of the Queer Lit Read-a-thon. So you can either read a book that has exactly 16 letters in the title, or if that's too challenging, any book with more than 16 letters in the title also counts. After a lot of contemplation and research, I actually found 3 titles that are exactly 16 letters each. The first is one of my favorite books, and that is The Best Bad Things by Katrina Carrasco. This could also count towards historical fiction and detective because it's a historical mystery/thriller set in the Pacific Northwest in the 1800s. The main character, Alma, is a Mexican-American spy, basically, formerly trained in espionage, but she was recently dismissed from her last agency because she has the taboo tendency of going undercover as a man named Jack Camp. But she eventually finds work again with a friend named Delphine who runs the West Coast smuggling ring, and Alma is charged with tracking down some missing product at their Washington Territory outpost, and she will have to don the disguise of Jack Camp once again if she wants to solve the case. If I've said it once, I've said it a million times, but this book is devilishly bisexual and gender fucky in every way you could possibly imagine or want. It is so good. I don't even have words enough to tell you how good it is. Just trust me on this one, and please read this book if you haven't yet. Secondly, If We Were Villains by ML Rio would also fit this prompt. This is another mystery thriller story with a bit of a dark academia edge to it. It's set at this elite art conservatory and following 7 fourth-year students who are all part of the theater program in which they exclusively study, recite, and perform Shakespeare's work. They usually get cast in the same kinds of roles no matter what production they're working on, but when the cast list for their upcoming production gets a major shakeup, it unleashes a well of built-up resentment, suspicion, and paranoia until the onstage drama dangerously spills over into real life and one of them is killed. I have not stopped thinking about this book ever since I read it. It's become something of a cult classic over the years for a very good reason, I think. The characters are absolutely unhinged and toxic, making their next move impossible to predict, which really keeps you guessing until the very end. And again, because the story largely revolves around Shakespeare's plays and studying at school, I think this could definitely satisfy the bookish prompt. And lastly, we have This Feast of a Life by Cynthia So. This is the sophomore release from the author of If You Still Recognize Me, which is a book that I love so much. This one is a contemporary foodie romance, I believe, about a non-binary character named Auden who's just getting used to going by their chosen name. And they also happen to run a food blog where they share their passion for cooking and all their favorite recipes. The other protagonist, Valerie, is navigating grief after losing her mother, and ever since her mom's death, Valerie and her father have been slowly drifting apart and their kitchen has been cold and empty. But when Valerie discovers Auden's blog, it really sparks something for her, and the two of them are able to find each other and connect. Even though I've had this release on my radar for such a long time at this point, I still have not read it yet myself. But again, this author really blew me away with their debut coming-of-age story, and I just know in my heart that this is also going to be something really special. I can't imagine it would be anything less than a great choice. So there you have it. Those are recommendations, suggestions, or ideas for every prompt on the Queer Lit Read-a-thon bingo board for round 16. Of course, these books are just the tip of the iceberg. If you have any other ideas for books that would fit these prompts, feel free to drop those down below in the comments and share with the rest of the class. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.